Much. I usually say, let's wait for a couple of minutes. It's taken me a couple of minutes, so let's go ahead and get started. By the way, my voice is a little bit hoarse today. I've been battling some kind of a bronchitis or something, and it does not seem to want to go away. It may have something to do with the fact that I've given something like 6 hours or 8 hours of talks in the last week, and so my voice is not getting the break that it deserves. And let's do another one today. I'm actually very excited to be giving this talk because the last time that I gave a talk similar to this one was about a little over 2 years ago, or maybe a little less than 2 years ago, actually. And that's when a lot of the backlash was kind of beginning and it was starting to become very visible. And now it's like very different. So I've updated some of the content and I'm really excited to talk to you about some of these things today. And before I begin, for those of you that have seen me speak before, I always like to start by addressing the white elephant in the room, and that's me. What is a white, cisgender, male, heterosexual man with no disabilities and every ounce of privilege on the planet doing, talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And trying to keep it fairly short, I immigrated to this country as a teenager. I became aware right away that there were some very strange issues related to, especially to race inequalities, but also I learned later a lot of things having to do with gender in the workplace. And I'd always been fascinated by it, but really just kind of as a passive observer. You know, I'd go to march once in a while, but I was not an activist. And in the meantime, in parallel, my career had taken me down the path of first through academia and then as a consultant and supporting a lot of large organizations. I had been working on a very unique approach to quantify the link between individuals and the collective. So I've done a lot of work in marketing analytics, a lot of work on, even things like simulating people on a highway, and understanding a lot of the work that I'd done was on talent management. And I had this approach that used computer simulations to quantify that link in a way that made it possible to understand what was happening at the individual level and then extrapolate what happens when a lot of individuals collaborate, what happens at the level of the organization. And then one day I was sitting in the umpteenth session on, how do we get more women into leadership roles? How do we get more people with disabilities to participate in the workforce? And as I was listening to the stark contrast between the individual experiences that people shared on the one hand, and on the other hand, when it came to the solutions, it was very vague and general. We need to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. And I wondered, how do you close that gap? And then the light bulb went off and I thought, wait a second, that's exactly what I've been doing for the past, at that time, it had been almost 20 years that I've been doing that work. And this was in 2015. And so I got really excited, dropped everything, started to do some research, built some simulations, proved to myself that I was onto something very interesting and dove in. And since then, I've spent my entire life for the last 8.5 years working in DEI. I've also learned a lot. I've learned a lot about the things that I don't know. And I realized that there's like way more that I don't know than I do know. I've also realized that as a white man, I have a responsibility because ultimately a lot of the problems that we see in society are the result of people like me, whether we do it wittingly or unwittingly, or willingly or unwittingly. And so I see it as being very important for people like me to kind of raise their voices and speak to people who look like me and say, hey, listen, this is something, here's how we can make things better. And here's why it goes to our own benefit and it's not just against everybody. So that's the white elephant. There is a much darker elephant right now in the room, which is that here we are talking about DEI and DEI myths in the middle of a very strong wave of backlash against DEI that ranges from corporate to, of course, both state and federal government, and really generally in society. And one thing that I've been talking about a lot recently is also academia. I still have a foothold in academia, and I've been going to some discussions about DEI in academia, and it's brutal. I think academia right now is probably the worst sector to be in as far as the backlash against DEI. And what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to address some of the kind of objections that have often been raised against DEI. And I think that there are some that are much deeper than others, but a lot of these are very, very common. Yesterday, I had the interesting experience of sitting in on an event that was about academia, talked about mandatory DEI statements in academia. And the idea is that there were two faculty members that were arguing opposing points. And cleverly, this organization had a Black man arguing against DEI statements and a white man arguing in favor of that. And there was a moderator. And what was interesting was to see the vitriol in the chat. I mean, it was horrible. And some of the questions that were being asked are these like old, trite, tired objections to DEI. And so even though they're changing tone and some of the objections have changed, I still think it's really worth it to understand what these objections are and to figure out how to counter them. And more importantly, how to react constructively. Because I find that a lot of times we have a tendency when we're confronted with something that we don't agree with, it's very easy to fall into a trap of trying to react in a way that is not very constructive. And I'm also going to talk about some other objections and things. And I'm hoping there will be some time at the end, depending on how quickly we go through the material, because I've always enjoyed hearing other people bring up other objections, and there are plenty of very common objections that are brought up. But so the ones that I'm going to talk about is the pipeline myth or the pipeline problem myth, the idea, oh, we only hire from the best schools, the idea that we don't want to lower the bar, we are a meritocracy, or this is one that it's a bit of, I have to explain this one a little bit more, but it's something that is very common as a white man in DEI. People, it's like, well, we tried to hire those people, but it just didn't work out. And then I want to talk about the business case for DEI, and I want to close with a very, very important one, because it turns out that I believe that this is actually one that has created the biggest problems, and it's one where we in DEI, I think, have made some mistakes in the way that we frame that particular issue. So let's start with an observation, which is that a lot of times you hear these issues and they sound reasonable. And the problem is that if you are a DEI supporter, you're like, yeah, whatever, I don't believe you. But if you are one of the vast majority of people who are maybe agnostic or maybe slightly against or slightly in favor of DEI, a lot of these objections sound very reasonable. We don't want to lower the bar. Well, should we hire a Black person who's less qualified just because they're Black instead of a white person? And it's, when you frame it that way, it sounds reasonable, right? And I like to use, I got a couple of cartoons in the first few slides because I love these, from Peanuts. It's like, I know that you're right and you're wrong, but you just sound right. And sometimes we get that sense. It's like, it's really frustrating because some of these arguments sound right, and a lot of people just buy into these arguments. So how do you respond? And one of the things that I've learned in my work is that there is a tendency for people to take a variety of different response styles. One, of course, there is the forceful style. You get angry, and I like to use these comics here. And this is what I call the forceful style. The forceful style is never going to work. It leads to wars, and so I really do not advocate it. One that I think is very, very common in the field is to be indignant. Okay, it's like, oh, I cannot believe you would even argue for that. How can you possibly say that? You're full of it. Another one that unfortunately is used a lot by people, but I find that it's a very, very slippery slope, is what I call the data-driven one. And I think this Dilbert cartoon really captures it. It's like, are you sure the data you gave me is correct? The session that I was in yesterday, it was amazing. There were people that were arguing. It's like, there's a lot of data that shows that there is no such thing as bias that is due to racial discrimination. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, how can you possibly say that? But the reality is that probably for every paper out there that proves one thing, you will find a paper that proves the opposite. And especially in these days of our own bubbles and the idea of fake news, which has created this amazing polarization, it seems like different groups get their news from different sources and they completely ignore each other's source. And if you hear something from the other side, you assume that it's false. So going to somebody with a bunch of data is just pointless. It's literally pointless. And then there is what I've heard sometimes people argue that it's like, well, we should do this because it's the right thing to do. Sadly, this is something that does not work, and it does not work. And I've written a paper about, or a blog about this in Forbes a few years ago, where I said, look, one of the things that I have to say that I respect about what, in case this is any question, I don't think of myself as being conservative at all, right? But I have to say that a lot of the arguments that I've seen from the conservative side, they do a very good job. And I'm using that sort of from an abstract point of view of analyzing somebody's ability to convince other people. And one thing that I found is that very often what I see is that those of us who are more on the liberal side tend to appeal to fairness and justice and, look at how this particular population has been discriminated against, et cetera. Whereas the other side often, what you hear from the other side is arguments along the lines of, if you pass this law, it will hurt the education of your child. And so when you're pitting a personal interest, a personal benefit, or in some cases, a personal damage against the well-being of some abstract population that you're not part of, it's incredibly difficult to win those arguments. So the last thing that I want to point out as something that always does not work is the idea of just going direct confrontation. And I think this is kind of a macroscopic observation. We have a tendency when we're confronted with something with which we disagree to just go head to head and try to prove that they're wrong. And my kids are now significantly older, but when they were little, I loved to read to them Dr. Seuss. And I think Dr. Seuss is an amazing source of valuable information, right? And there is a story that I think is very relevant here about the north-going Zacks and the south-going Zacks. And I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this, but it's the idea of these two characters that bump into each other, one of them going north, one of them going south, and they're stuck. And basically they start arguing, and they argue, and they basically end up not refusing to budge in one direction or the other. and they stay there for years and years and years. And at the end, what you see is that in the final slide, it's like, you know, they built a highway right over those two stubborn Zeks, and they left them there standing unbudged in their tracks. I see very, very often this kind of approach where you hear an argument and you try to debunk it head on. And that's a very unlikely approach to succeed. So if those approaches don't succeed, what can work? Well, what I found and what I'm going to share with you today is a couple of approaches that I think can be more fruitful. One of them is to look for flaws in the argument itself, or very often in the assumptions on which the argument is based. And more generally, try to understand how the argument is framed. Because very often what I find is that it's the framing that is wrong. It's not the argument itself. So if you take the argument in a limited scope in which it is couched, the argument is often actually correct. The problem is when you, or the way that you can debunk those very often is to kind of broaden your viewpoint, look at it from a different perspective, and realize that the very way that the argument was framed was wrong. And I'm going to actually, I had not opened the chat window, so I see there is a chat. Oh, okay. And Chris, that's actually a really good point, but let's talk about it toward the end when we do the Q&A. So, you know, Chris Jones suggested sometimes using history and finding an analogy. I'm a huge fan of analogies. Any of you that have been to any of my other talks know that analogies are something that I'm a very big fan of. But so let me show you as examples. I'm going to go through a series of these arguments, the ones that I mentioned earlier. So, and let me start with the pipeline problem myth. So the general problem that you hear is, oh, you know, we can't find enough female engineers or Black people with a certain number of years of experience, or people with disabilities, or vendors who are underrepresented minorities, or blah, 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 blah. And I tend to counter that argument in two different ways. The first thing that I say is your company just an open field that people walk in and out of? You know, is this the way that it looks, right? Do you just have like a big vacuum cleaner that sucks up whoever is walking by? I've had people come to me and say, oh, you know, we're in Vermont, and they're mostly white people in Vermont. And so, and like, okay, but is this how you choose parts for your products? Is this how you choose the artwork for your market? I mean, do you just settle for average? Do you just like open the doors and say, well, anybody that wants to do my marketing campaigns is welcome to come and draw something for me. And oh, well, I happen to be in a part of town where there are no artists, and so all of my campaigns look horrible. Of course not. You know, what about lawyers? I mean, basically the point being that any other asset that organizations use, they're always very careful about finding things that they believe are better for them, whether it's, you know, cheaper or more expensive or higher quality or easier to use or better to integrate. But the point is that, to me, when you complain about the pipeline problem, you're essentially reflecting a degree of laziness. You're not making a sufficient effort. And then you use the excuse that, well, there aren't enough people of that thing. But there's a second point that I like to argue with people, is that even if you want to complain that, for example, well, you know, it's very hard to get women with computer science degrees. It's very hard to get people of color with, you know, whatever kind of backgrounds. That may be true. However, if you look at the data, it is pretty clear that the representation of people that get certain degrees is higher than their same representation in the workplace. So if you look, for example, at the number of women that get computer science degrees, or the number of people of color that get computer science degrees, or engineering, and so on and so forth, you find that there's not a match, that you still may have, you're likely in a lot of organizations, especially predominantly white organizations, you're likely to see a disparity between what's available out there. And again, and those are also averages. It's like, you know, look, even if you fall for the average, the point is you're still not right. So you can see what I've done here, right? Is I've tried to say, you know, yeah, I'm not going to argue with you that there are, well, you know, but there are a few Black people in Vermont. I'm not going to argue with that. But this kind of steps aside and says, okay, let's be realistic about the fact that this is not the way that you really run your organization. And what are some of the factors that influence your pipeline? Well, it's going to be things like the current level of diversity in your organization, your reputation as an inclusive organization. Also, one of the things that has a huge influence on who you end up hiring is over-reliance on your network. If you do things like employee referrals, and you start out with mostly white employees, you're going to end up with a ton of referrals that are for more white male employees, right? And again, ultimately, a lot of it goes back to your willingness to put some effort into finding a larger portion of the population. So if you come back to me and you say, well, you know, I don't really care, I don't really see any reason why it should be more diverse, that's a different argument. But ultimately, you want to think about it. And by the way, I do another workshop, which I have not done in a while, but I may do again in the future, which is specifically about recruiting. And I talk about the 6 pages of recruiting and hiring and how diversity and inclusion influences each one of them. Now, the second myth that I want to talk about is closely related, and it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. And I remember being part of an entrepreneurial group in New York City when I was starting a different startup. This was about, gosh, by now it's been about 15 years ago, 13 years ago. I was creating a startup, and I would go to these meetings where there were a bunch of people. And I remember somebody saying, hey, I want some advice. I will only hire people from Ivy League, and I want to know, like, what's your best strategy that you recommend for doing that? I will only hire people from Ivy League. And I happen to find that to be really annoying. You know, this was in a founders network that I saw. Actually, it's no longer very recently. It was a few years ago. You know, this guy, actually, this was a message that was posted on a bulletin board. Similar tone though, right? Money is no object. We will only hire from the best schools, right? So it turns out that there are actually two fundamental problems with this. Leaving aside the fact that it perpetuates systemic biases, it also happens to be a really poor business decision. The reason why people do this is because better schools do tend to be more selective, and they tend to have higher quality students. They also, undeniably, because they have more resources, more money, larger endowments, they have the resources to provide more rigorous training on average. And there is a certain shine, especially when everybody loves Ivy League schools, that there is a certain, glimmer in the eyes of people that's like, oh my God, you got your degree from Harvard or Columbia or one of the Ivy League schools. And of course, these people come with very strong networks. Now, all of these points are true, at least in part, but they're not absolutes. And one of the things that I want to point out is that there are several problems from hiring top schools. I'm sorry. There's somebody who is unmuted. Please mute yourself. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, forget for the edges, isn't it?
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
Somebody here is, Sami, I'm going to. There we go. Sorry, one of you, Sami Ben Ali, you were unmuted and we could hear you speaking, so I just muted you. So, first point that was here. Education-based measures correlate very poorly with on-the-job performance. There are lots of data, and I should have shared here some links, but I'll be happy anybody that wants to do that. It's been proven fairly clearly that education-based measures correlate poorly with on-the-job performance. There was a phenomenal article by a gentleman by the name of Musa Al-Garbi, who is actually now at CUNY, whichever one the one is that's on Long Island. And he wrote this phenomenal article in which basically he points out that not only are these correlations very poor, but also that a lot of what makes Ivy League students who come from these kinds of schools more successful is that they know how to network and they know how to make themselves look good. And it's not necessarily translating into higher performance in terms of productivity for the organization. A lot of academic training is often of limited use for workplace preparedness. How many managers say, yeah, I'm gonna have to completely retrain you from day one because everything you learned in school is largely useless. But more importantly, as a business, it's a bad decision because you're paying an enormous premium if you go to a top school. I used to be an adjunct and actually at a research center at one of the CUNY schools. And CUNY, as you may know, it's one of the most diverse school systems in the country. It has some 26, I think, campuses around New York. Some of them incredibly, and I don't want to say diverse, ones where we have like 80% African-American students kind of thing. And overall, very diverse. And some of those students struggle to get jobs after getting their degrees in technology fields, while 40 blocks down, you go to Columbia and you have like a 98% job acceptance rate within your first year of graduating, but you're getting paid twice as much. So the problem is that as a company, if you can afford that and you can throw money out the window, that's great. But keep in mind that you're competing for a very scarce resource against the largest research organizations in the world. And one of the things that I want to point out is that if you think about it, and I'm kind of a geek, right? So I like to use equations and things like that. The way that people sometimes think about it is say, well, look, the average quality of these students in Ivy League schools is much higher. And so what I did here is I said, okay, well, let's assume that talent is distributed along bell curves. And let's assume that the yellow curve represents the average, whatever you want to call it, talent, intelligence, preparation, performance of all Ivy League students. And the green one is for non-Ivy League, or not even say, let's say top 50, I think this was like top 50 colleges in the country. Now, it turns out that this is based on a ridiculous assumption that the average is about 3 standard deviations higher than it is for the green one, right? But even if that were the case, it turns out that this chart has a fundamental problem, which is that the reality is that this is assuming that you have the same number of people, right? You can do all your math and whatever, But it turns out that the top 50 schools in the country only make up about 3% of the student population, which means, there are 20 million students roughly in the United States and about only 600,000 in the top 50 schools, which means that the reality is like this. The reality is that there are significantly more top talent students in the bottom 300, whatever, however many schools there are in the country, than there are combined in all of the top 50 schools. Now, it's going to be more difficult to find them, I agree with you, but when you combine that with the fact that you're paying a lot of money for these students, you realize that, hey, you'd be much better off finding students from some of these other schools. And incidentally, having taught at schools in the CUNY system, I can tell you that even though on paper, some of the students may not look as spectacular, when you have a single mom who's taking night courses to get her master's degree in finance while working a full-time job and taking care of children at school, I will hire her any day over an Ivy League graduate, okay? Because these are people that know how to get stuff done. And I've seen that over and over and over again. So the correct analysis, not going to bore you with the numbers, but the correct analysis is that basically you would be significant, no matter what reason you have, you would be better off going to non-top schools. And then, of course, adding insult to injury, a lot of the top schools are predominantly white institutions, which means that you're perpetuating deeply rooted forms of structural racism and sexism. And that, of course, also manifests itself because then you've gone to that school, so you donate money to that school. So now that school has a huge endowment. And now if you don't like the black woman who's running the university and you're a billionaire, you can say, I'm going to take all my money out unless you fire this woman, right? And this really is a terrible, terrible thing that we're seeing in our society right now. So in other words, recruiting from top schools is really a very, very bad business decision, and it perpetuates systemic biases. And by the way, one of the things that I always do, I've written a ton of blogs in which I tackle a variety of what I see to be flawed arguments. One of the things that I always try to do, and it goes back to what I said earlier about the right thing to do, I always start with a logical business argument and then say, oh, and by the way, it's also societally not a good thing to do. And I find that arguing this way is much more effective because if you lead with a societal benefit, a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not this, or whatever the case might be. So the next one that I want to talk about, the approach is a little bit different. This is what I call the lowering the bar myth. Well, there are so few, take your pick, right? Black, women, LGBTQ, disabled, all of the above candidates, that we would have to lower the bar in order to increase diversity. And I have a very, very simple way of rebuking that argument, which is to say, show me the stupid bar. And I don't necessarily say stupid, right? It's like, where's the bar? You tell me that there is a bar, but here's what I want to know. Do not make any bar lowering claims unless you can, first of all, show me the quantitative criteria that you use with every single candidate that you hire. Whether it's the CEO's son or somebody that you played golf with or somebody that you went to school with or somebody off the street, I want to see that you actually have a bar and that you actually have a mathematically tractable system that used to do that. Show me the data that you collected over the years and show me that there is actually a statistically significant correlation between your hiring bar and long-term performance. Now, usually I don't have to get through all three of these bullets because once I get to the first one, people are like, oh, I am very good at judging people based on their background. And I'm like, okay, sure. So don't talk to me about the bar. Let's talk about the fact that you're using your own unconscious biases. You're doing a similarity matching, and don't talk to me about the bar. If you really do believe in the bar, which you should, then you would set some very rigid criteria or very clear criteria and use them all the time. Now, there's various versions of this myth, right? But one of them is slightly different, but same idea. We really wanted our organization to be more diverse. We reviewed 2 candidates, blah, blah. One was a member of a diverse group, but the other one was a white guy, but he was more qualified. And here, this is something that always kind of, it gets me a little bit annoyed. But again, I try not to show annoyance and I try to think about it. And I asked them, I say, well, how do you measure qualification? This is very similar to lowering the bar, right? We're not good at specifying the characteristics that lead to success. And one of the things that we often tend to do is we do pattern matching, right? Well, I did well in my career. This guy looks like me, went to the same school, has the same background. So he's likely to do well too. But it turns out that there is actually a deeper problem here, which is how you define qualifications. And it turns out that if you look at the vast majority of recruiting criteria, they're based on very narrow definitions of job-related performance metrics, right? And a lot of times they fail to consider other factors that impact the individual and the company performance. So we're like, oh, well, here's a set of criteria. Well, how many years of experience do you have? And what college did you go to? And things like that. Also, I've never seen or almost never seen a set of job criteria that considers the intangibles that are so crucial to the success of the whole company, like being supportive, being team-oriented, being caring, being altruistic, being collegial, right? And so my suggestion for this thing is to make sure that diversity should be one of the job qualification criteria. And my firm belief is that other characteristics aside, hiring someone from a different background can have very tangible benefits. For example, they can help you to identify ways to create a more inclusive environment. That can help you to attract talent from a broader pool. That can help you to become more innovative. There's a lot of evidence that having diversity of thought, right? But having different kinds of people around the table can be quite beneficial, and it can help you to expand your target markets. How many stories do we hear about companies that wanted to go develop a product for women and they had a whole bunch of guys developing them? We hear this all the time, still today, and it's just like mind-boggling to me that people would do that. Now, the next topic that I want to talk about is meritocracy. One of the, people consider that the silver bullet of like the anti-DEI thing. It's like, we are a meritocracy. We're colorblind. We basically have a way of only promoting people based on their merit. So meritocracy sounds like a good thing. I happen to think meritocracy is a terrible thing, but let me explain what I mean by that. Well, a meritocracy is defined as a system in which advancement is based on individual ability or achievement, okay? So my questions would be the following. Who's defining ability and who's defining achievement? And how are these qualities and objectives measured? Now, the reality of meritocracies is that whoever decides on the definitions and criteria is very likely to be injecting their both conscious and unconscious biases. And instead, the use of hard and consistent performance, which would be beneficial to actually arguing that meritocracy, is rarely used. And one of the things that I recommend to people, this is the book that came out, I think it was 2017, 18, somewhere in there. It's a few years old now, maybe 19. It was this book called Brotopia by Emily Chang. And it's a great story. It reads like a novel, right? But basically, one of the things that she points out is that while giving the illusion of fairness, it leads to a rich getting richer dynamic, because you create criteria that are based on how you succeeded. And so you basically bring in more and more people that are like you, and it makes you more successful and you make more money. So it amplifies and builds existing biases. It reduces the representation of talented people from underappreciated, underprivileged, underrepresented groups. And really, a meritocracy is nothing more than a self-fulfilling and self-sustaining system that exacerbates a lot of the systemic disparities. And really, what you need to ask yourself is you need to think about, if I really truly want to have something that approaches the ideal of a meritocracy, how do you do that? How do you actually reward performance? And this is one of the things that always trips people up. And I'm so surprised by the sheer volume of evidence for the importance of bias proofing your performance evaluations. Performance evaluations are one of the most critical elements of virtually every company out there, because typically they decide raises, bonuses, promotions, assignments, blah, 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 blah. And yet, so many companies do evaluations in a very qualitative way. And what really needs to happen is that whenever an organization, if I had to give one piece of advice to every company out there about how to become more diverse and more inclusive, this is probably one of the most crucial aspects of every company that gets overlooked. So you should make sure that you're establishing performance criteria, and make sure that you have the help of members of a variety of groups to mitigate biases. I want to give you one example of something that just shocked me years ago. I was invited to speak at a very large financial services organization, and they were concerned, and they approached me because they were specifically concerned about their low retention rates for women. Okay, so I'm talking to them, we're going back and forth, I'm showing you some of these simulations. And then I talked about this idea of, hey, I said, we do great. We have this system where we evaluate people and we give them a score, and we use that score for promotions, et cetera. And so I look at this checklist of criteria, and one of them was basically face time. It was basically, how many hours a week do you spend in the office? Now, this was pre-COVID, so the notion of hybrid, remote, et cetera, didn't even exist then. But I looked at it and said, wait a second, you are rewarding people for how many hours they spend in the office, which means that you're immediately penalizing women. Immediately. It means that even if a woman is going home and doing the work from home after juggling, making dinner for her husband, cleaning up, taking care of the kids, doing all these things, she's doing work and she may be doing phenomenally well with clients, but you're going to be penalizing her because she's only at the office for 40 hours a week, while some dude is in the office 80 hours a week, and that dude may, God knows what they're doing, right? Maybe they're very productive, maybe they're not. So to me, that was just mind-blowing that they did not see that, and they did not see that as a bias. Also, one of the things I always encourage people to do is go beyond the narrow definition of job tasks, duties, and goals. And this is similar to what I said before. It's like when you're hiring people or when you're evaluating the performance, a lot of times I see this, again, this is a bit of a gender divide. Women in general are more likely either to volunteer or to be asked to do what I would call household tasks or administrative tasks, which may include taking notes during meetings or cleaning up after meetings or being the ones that are asked to organize the luncheons. But in many cases, it's other things. It's recognizing that there is an inefficiency in the process and then saying, hey, let's fix this. In so doing, you're creating tremendous support for other people and you're not getting recognized for it. In fact, you may get penalized as, she's spending too much time doing these things and not focusing enough on sales. And that's a devastating flaw that I see in a lot of companies. And in general, anything that you can do to formalize performance review processes to avoid any single point of bias process or any process that allows biases to be perpetuated is one of the best things that you can do. And in general, it's actually relatively easy. I have another talk that I do that talks about organizational biases, but it's not that difficult to conduct audits of a lot of your processes in your organization to figure out which ones may be biased. The next item that I want to debunk is one that started to become very common to me whenever I would be in a social setting and I'd be talking to a guy and the guy's like, hey, what do you do for work? And I would say, oh, I work in diversity and inclusion or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the first reaction is like, well, you're weird. You must be gay. You must have a disability. I was like, no, but I love the field. And so you start talking, and after that initial shock wears off, the question that I got all the time was, or the comment, oh yeah, my company, we try to hire a woman as a chief engineer or as a VP of engineering, but things just didn't work out. She just literally did not work out, and we ended up having to fire her. So the first time that I was faced by that question, I was like, okay, how do I know that there's something fundamentally wrong with this? And I could say, there's a lot of ways that I could think about facing that. But then I realized there's a couple of very easy ways to debunk this, okay? One of them is the last time that a white male colleague messed up, did you attribute it to his gender or his ethnicity? Like, did you go around and say, oh, that white man, just got fired because he was stealing pencils from the supply room, or because he was embezzling money from the company? I mean, how many of the top white-collar crimes that we've seen in the past were done by Black women? I don't know that I've ever heard of any. But do we say, oh, another white man went to jail because of, embezzlement? Do we say that? No, we don't say that. So it's very common. Our brains are wired to bucket things that we see, whether they're people, whether they are chairs, whether they are whatever the case might be. And so the problem is that it becomes much easier. Unfortunately, there is the thing that's called the own race bias, which is that when we're surrounded by people of a certain ethnicity, it becomes a lot easier to see subtle differences between them. It's just like any skill, any skill, whether it's listening to music or learning a language, until you're exposed to something a lot, it's very difficult to create these very fine categorizations. And the same is true. When people complain that, white people think that all Black people look alike, there's some truth to that. If you're not accustomed to being around Black people, then you don't have in your brain, literally your brain is incapable of seeing subtle differences. And the problem is that when we apply that in the workforce, that's where it gets problematic. But the second point that I make to these people is say, listen, if that person was the only one or one of the few, is it possible that the odds were stacked against them? Or put a different way, did you actually do anything to help this person? Because there is a very good chance that our systems are biased, or your company had some structures in place, and even the way that people behave, that made it incredibly difficult. It made it very difficult for the person to fit with everybody else. And imagine the pressure of being in a situation where you're different from everybody else, and on top of that, everybody knows that you were the diversity hire, or everybody assumes, excuse me, everybody assumes that you were the diversity hire. And so I tell them, I said, would you like to be in that place? And then it's like, oh, okay, these are pretty valid points. So all of these are things that you can kind of see the thread here, right? It's like, instead of just going head on, try to step out for a moment, think about it, and then ask yourself, what aspect of this was framed incorrectly? The point here is not that, oh, let's make excuses for this woman. Well, this was in the case of the first example that came to mind was this particular woman that a friend of mine was telling me had been hired as a VP of engineering. But it's really asking, okay, do you do this? Do you do the same thing with white men? Do you apply the same rules? So there are a lot of other ones, but I want to kind of end with one that actually has actually two, I'm sorry, that have a particularly important meaning to me because they're very, very closely tied to the work that we do at Aleria. And the first one that I want to address is what I call the business case myth. And both the business case myth and the other one I'm going to talk about, which is the reverse discrimination, actually have two sides where I believe that both the people that are in favor of DEI as well as the people that are against DEI have used some what I believe to be very flawed arguments. And so I'm going to try to kind of, in this case, kind of take out a bit of a stick on both sides of the fence, right? So the common thing that we hear is, I hear actually two things. One of them is, what is the business case for diversity? And it's like, oh, how, why are they asking me for the business case of diversity? And the flip side of that is that often I hear people talk about the fact that, oh, the business case for diversity has been proven, which I happen to believe is also a myth, and it's actually not really true the way that most people mean that. I may or may not have time to go into that, but let me talk about the business case. And rather than getting into the fine points of exactly how people ask that or who asked that, I'm going to tell you how I address the business case. And the fundamental point here is that I believe that the only way to convince a leader of an organization to embrace DEI is to make them understand not the broad business case, not how, oh, statistically speaking, this group of companies had a slightly higher performance along this KPI than this other group of companies. And by the way, going back to what I was saying before about the data-driven, let me tell you, there are a lot of studies that basically show two things. A, there are situations in which greater diversity actually makes matters worse. B, there are studies that have debunked, for example, the McKinsey correlation study that shows that companies in a higher percentile of diversity actually perform better. Now, I'm not going to say those arguments are right, those data are right or wrong. The point is, there is just as much data arguing for one side than for the other. So I sidestep all of that completely. And what I do is I take a very different approach, and it's a very simple two-step argument. The first one is I say, okay, if you're the CEO of a company, the DEO of a company, if you're the CEO of a company, I want to ask you, what do you do? How do you manage your assets in general, right? Well, we know that when it comes to managing assets, we know that portfolio management techniques tell us that diversification of assets is usually a good thing. So for example, we use portfolio management to manage our financial assets to generate greater returns. We use programmatic advertising to diversify our marketing campaigns so that we can generate greater sales. So it stands to reason that if we think of our people as an asset, as a human asset, then it stands to reason that diversifying your human assets in some way will have some impact. It's not necessarily good or bad, but the problem is that today we have no tools that can help us to understand what will happen to a company, not statistically speaking across 500 companies, to my company. I'm the CEO, and I want you to tell me, if I wave the magic wand and I go from being all white to being completely diverse or somewhere in between, how is that going to change the performance of my company? And the answer is we have absolutely no idea. So my first step is to get the CEO curious or the CFO by saying, well, shouldn't you know? I mean, clearly something is going to happen. We know that in every other asset management category, diversification works. And so the second part is to say, okay, this is not just an idle question, because, and some of you might have seen some of these slides in some of my other talks, but I ask people to think about the total amount of money spent by every company in the United States in 1 year on advertising and on payroll. And I ask people, sometimes I do a poll and I say, well, which one do you think is bigger? Often people guess it's advertising. Occasionally people guess it's payroll. Virtually nobody realizes that payroll is about 30 times as much as advertising. Now, this is not to say that in every single company, payroll is 30 times as much as advertising, but I guarantee you that in virtually every single company out there, payroll is higher and usually much higher than advertising. So then my question is, if you're the CEO of a company, you have an asset that is the largest budget item of your balance sheet, of your P&L, actually, in this case, and your balance sheet, and you don't know the impact of diversifying it, well, then I'm sorry, you're failing your responsibility to your shareholders. Forget your employees. You're failing. You know, if you're Fortune 500, the average payroll for Fortune 500 is $1 billion a year. And that's the average one. For Google, it's literally tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. Actually, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. For Amazon, same thing. So you should be dying to learn DEI, because if you think of DEI as a way of learning how to optimize or diversify your human assets so that you can actually optimize the performance or at least increase the performance of your company, think about how much money you can make. And that's, if you come to the other workshop that I do, which is about measuring inclusion, I go into a lot more details about how you would do that. But as I've done before, after presenting the business point, I also say there is a societal angle, which is that actually asking to prove the business case is kind of an offensive thing to do. It's like, what's the business case for homogeneity? I've actually written another article about that. It's like, what's the business case for homogeneity? Why would you argue that homogeneity is a business case? Why do I need to prove the business? Now, the reality is that it's not unreasonable to ask, help me figure out how I can create a better company by making these choices, right? But sometimes the business case becomes a very offensive, it becomes a very insulting thing. It's like, why the hell do I need to prove that, right? So the last thing that I want to talk to you about is reverse discrimination. And this is where things get very dicey. And again, some of you have probably seen some of the slides from one of my other talks, but I thought it would be very important to bring it up here. A few years ago, in 2022, I had a guy stand up at the end of it was video, but unmute himself at the end of a presentation that had roughly 200 women and probably 4 or 5 guys. And this one guy unmutes himself and says, let's face it. First, it was diversity. Now it's diversity and inclusion. The reality is that there are a lot of qualified, talented, young men sitting by the sidelines, unable to get work because of the quotas to hire women. To which I thought, wow, if anybody's going to make a comment like that after my presentation in front of 200 women, it's like, it's bad. Because if he said that, there's probably, well, in that case, there were not a lot of men in the audience, but I've heard many versions of that comment since then. It turns out that the reverse discrimination has been, in my opinion, the single biggest reason for the backlash. That's the one that everybody's really kind of clung on to. But it turns out that there is a reason for that. And that is because setting targets based on diversity alone is actually a form of reverse discrimination. This is, I believe, why the Supreme Court rejected the affirmative action for college recruiting. And let me explain what I mean by that, okay? And you will see how this fits into the bigger picture. Imagine a hypothetical company of 1,000 employees, of whom 20% identify as white women, 5% as women of color, 5% as men of color, the rest is white men. That bar chart on the right shows the representation as it is today. And now imagine that the CEO and the chief diversity officer come out and say, we see the light. We believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're going to set targets. And those targets are going to be for 3 years. We're going to increase the number of women to 30%, or the percentage of women to 30%, percentage of women of color to 8%, and men of color to 8%. And because diversity is so good for us, we believe that we're going to grow by a healthy 20%. So here's what it's going to look like in 3 years from now. Well, the problem is that if you look at it, you realize that the only way to get there is to increase the number of women of color and men of color by 46 each, increase the number of white women by 160, while decreasing the number of white men by 52. And I'm really sorry, but this is reverse discrimination. It's discrimination based on gender and based on ethnicity. And it's wrong. But it turns out that this is where remember what I said earlier, is that sometimes you have to reframe the problem. This problem is framed incorrectly. And I'm going to appeal, please, I beg, all of you who are in DEI positions, especially leadership positions. If you're setting targets based on representation at the overall company level, you are making a very big mistake. And I'm going to beg you to please read some of the things that I've written for why that's the case. Because when you do that, you're just simply trying to fix the symptoms. And trying to fix the lack of diversity by hiring more diverse candidates is a very dangerous thing to do. All right. I hope that whoever unmuted yourself, I don't think you were asking a question. It sounds like there was noise in the background. So if I walk into my house one day and I feel that it's really cold, and I look at the thermostat and it says it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever, 15 or so, 14, 13 degrees centigrade. And I say, oh, I know how to fix that. I'm going to light a match under the thermostat. And now the temperature is going to go up. But in the meantime, the windows are open and the front door is drafty and the roof is leaking, and I'm going to burn the house down. And this is exactly what's happening. And what I want people to understand is that we're trying to fix the symptoms. We need to understand the causes. And the causes become very clear when, instead of just taking this broad overview of the overall level of diversity, you look at what happens to people as they go from the entry level to the executive level. These are data from McKinsey and Lean In. This is not about subjective correlations, impressions, whatever. This is hard data about the representation of white men, white women, women of color, and men of color, which is why I was using those 4 buckets, as they proceed from entry level to C-suite across all companies in the United States, meaning, aggregated. And you can see that white men pick up a staggering 23% representation, while all of the other groups combined, and especially Black women, they have an enormous loss. Now, what does that mean? That means that the problem is not that we need to stuff more water. It's a leaky bucket, and just opening the faucet wider isn't going to help the problem. So we need to stop trying to argue about fixing the symptoms, because when we do that is when we create this backlash, and we're asking for the wrong thing. We need to figure out, why are we losing these people? Why are people leaving at much higher rates who are not white, who are not male, who are not heterosexual, who do not have any disabilities? Why is that the case? That's what we need to figure out. And that's actually the topic of a different conversation. But so one of the reasons why I use this example is because I want to show how a lot of times we get stuck in our own bubbles. And we need to be careful, because I don't know how many times I've been in a room where some guy will raise their hand, especially in the last year and a half or so, and complain about reverse discrimination. And all of the people in the room who are not white men will be sitting there rolling their eyes. But the fact is, they have a point. They have a point. And we need to acknowledge that it's our fault for focusing on, even with the best of intentions, I believe that we're focusing on the wrong targets. And we really need to focus on stopping the bleeding before, or at least in conjunction with, trying to increase diversity through hiring. Because otherwise it's just a revolving door, and you're bringing people in and they turn around and leave, and it generates bad reputation, it generates negative feelings, and it's really something that you don't want to do. So I don't know, there's going to be about 10 minutes left. There's not really a whole lot more I want to talk to you about. I do want to point out 2 things, a little bit of self-promotion. One of them is I have a book coming out in September. It's available for pre-order on Amazon. If you just go to Amazon and you look up Measuring Inclusion, you'll find my book. And I'm actually also speaking about this regularly, because I think that some of these topics are so important. In the book, actually, the last 2 chapters, the first chapter tackles a lot of they're both about myths, but one of them is about things that I believe have been misguided or misleading people on the DEI side, and then the ones that are on the other side. So a lot of them, of the things that we talked about today, you will see in basically the final 2 chapters of the book. On April 30th, so that's less than a week away, I'm actually giving one of my standard Measuring Inclusion workshops. And I think, I know some of you have already been to some of those, but for those of you who have not, you may just want to go to aleria.tech/events and look up that particular webinar if you're interested in that as well.